Hi everybody, so we're back.
Welcome. Yes, we're
Talking
back.
Canon this week and where these texts came from and what's in the table of contents and why. I think for me, one of the things, and we were talking about this before, one of the things I think we wanted to emphasize is how human in some ways this whole process of canonization was. And not in the way that it's sometimes sensationalized. So if you read the Da Vinci Code, right, you would think that there was this secret cabal of people in a smoky room deciding things together. I think it was a bit more organic and that much messier, right?
Yeah.
That it was accidents of history, or what did people discover was meaningful to them?
Yeah.
That it was less sometimes about what some certain powerful people wanted or not, and that happened.
Yeah.
But it was also just kind of what rose up from the grassroots, and what texts did people share with one another, and what texts did they happen to use. That it had less to do with a committee with criteria and more to do with what people actually used on the ground. I think that's definitely true in the New Testament. I don't know if it's true in the Old Testament quite as much, but there's this kind of human process throughout all this, which means that we have to think about this text not again as golden tablets or this coming down from heaven, but that this infusion of both divine inspiration and human hands.
And I mean, many of these texts and the canonical processes they went through were deeply political, right? And were related to power, of course, and related to community identity. One thing's, for instance, of the Qumran community, the Dead Sea Scrolls community, and we don't know, what they considered to be authoritative at the time, because in many cases, for instance, in Jeremiah, you have two very different versions of Jeremiah attested to at the Dead Sea. And so what does that mean? That they have multiple versions of a single book?
And that there were faithful people for a long time without canons.
That's right. Yeah, that's right.
At some point, there's some movement.
Right.
We can wonder why that is.
Right.
That shut things down and say, these are our texts and no other. But that actually takes a long time to get there. Yeah. To imagine what would faithfulness look like in a context where there isn't a close collection of books, where the world is much bigger than that, or the kind of textual world is bigger than.
That's right, and it gets to the question of revelation as well, and how we think about revelation, inspiration. I mean, Judaism is an interesting example to hold in tension with Christianity, because they have, of course, the Torah, which is the chief section of the Old Testament that is authoritative, but then they also have oral Torah, which is a reference to the later rabbinic literature, which in many ways is more authoritative, or that becomes the primary place where I think they imagine revelation to be happening. But that's a way beyond the biblical period. And in many ways, that kind of oral Torah can still happen within Judaism.
And we might wonder if there are ways in which our own traditions, we don't call it oral Torah, we don't treat it that way, but are there interpretations that seem so natural? Because it's right there in the text, except it's not. But
like the Apostles' Creed, the creeds.
Yeah, so they kind of this... Or notions like law and gospel or things like that, right?
That's right.
These hermeneutical, it's a fancy word. So it's kind of these interpretive assumptions that we bring that might have more to do with the traditions we're a part of than the texts themselves. And not to say then to reject them, but to know where they've come from is really important then, because when you encounter people with very different assumptions, you don't just throw the Bible at them and say, see, it's right there in the Bible. It's in the Bible, it's in our interpretive tradition together.
I think that's really important, and then to think reflectively, like what revelatory status does tradition have? Should it have any at all? In fact, I would say it's inevitable that that we participate in this. The law and gospel thing is one example. The whole notion of a Trinity, right? A fully formed doctrine of the Trinity, at least I would argue, is not fully expressed within the New Testament.
I always say, we'll talk about this when we get to the Gospels, right? It took the church several hundred years to figure out the Trinity. Yeah. It's a gracious thing to do not to assume that Mark had it figured out. Fully formed when it took the church that long to really settle these debates.
Oh, that's really good.
So these very human texts, and I think that there's a theological question there for us about how authority is found in these texts and how we talk about that. You also read an article that
this guy wrote,
that I wrote, and one of my former colleagues, Mary Hinkle-Shore, wrote. We were kind of doing this debate about whether or not we should open or close the canon, which I think it's less about actually deciding whether or not we should do it, but I think it will reveal lots of assumptions we have about what kind of texts these are. So we were talking before, and I in the article you see that I said no, we shouldn't reopen it for all the reasons I listed there. But if we were to reopen it, like what would we include? And my suggestion was to include Martin Luther King letter from Birmingham jail.
Yeah.
I mean, it's this piece of powerful prophecy. It is Word of God, I think, in a very significant sense. So I don't want to reopen it, but if we did, something like that might be first in line for me, because what I like about it is it's so profoundly contextual, like some of the other texts, right? So it's not this abstract theological thinking, but it's this very particular moment, this very particular situation that talks about God and God's justice.
Yeah.
And I think it would resonate powerfully. I don't want to add it, but if we're
he's backing off.
But that'd be so resonant with the text of Scripture.
So I totally want it open.
We'll say more about that.
Okay, I want it open, and let me begin with what I would like to include there.
Yeah.
Well, first of all, let me say it's already open on some level, in the sense that you have different forms of Christianity using different canons. So there is we can't even speak about the canon, right? So we have Roman Catholic canons. We mentioned earlier the Ethiopic, and the Ethiopic I think is actually the largest canon. And then you have the various Orthodox churches. And so on and so forth, who have different canon lists, and we have the shortest. As Protestants, we have the shortest canon. And I would love to include Esther and Jeremiah in their Septuagintal form. That is to say, the form used by the Orthodox and the form used by the Ethiopic churches.
They're in Greek.
That are in Greek. That's right. Yeah, this is the Septuagint, which we mentioned in an earlier lecture, is a Greek translation of a Hebrew text. But the reason I point out Esther, and when I say Jeremiah, and maybe some of Daniel, is that those texts are very different in their Greek form than they are in their Hebrew form that we are based on, the Leningrad-Enzia text that I mentioned earlier. Let's look at Esther, for example. Esther doesn't mention God, right?
The word God is not in...
God is not there in the book of Esther. And, the later rabbi said, the verbal root satar has to do with hiding. And so maybe that was very, very playful, beautifully done. But God is all over the place in the Septuagintal version. And it's interesting to think about why that might be. I want to have those two in there right next to each other so that it will raise questions about the plurality of the Bible and about different Christian communities. So,
what else do you want to add?
Oh, gosh.
The Shack.
The Shack.
Left Behind.
I was having a hard time thinking about
the
what
Matrix.
Modern day. Yeah, the Matrix would definitely be in there. All of Star Trek would be in.
Star Wars
and both. All Yoda quotes Yoda would have his own book with quotations.
The Book of Yoda, that'd be pretty good.
That's it, right? The Book of Yoda, right? Exactly right. And I guess let's see. Yeah, so I'm not sure about the modern period, but I would want to include a number of rabbinic texts, and in particular the texts that are often called like Rabbah, so Genesis Rabbah or Exodus Rabbah, and these are essentially midrashic commentaries on biblical books, and I think they're so valuable and insightful that I would love to see them in the canon.
Yeah, when I think about some of the extra-canonical, or we call extra-canonical New Testament texts, a lot of which we found in recent years, I often find that what they're really important for me, I think, and I don't want to open the canon to include them, because what they're useful for, I think, is to remind us of the diversities of early Christianity.
Yeah.
That it wasn't as if there's this direct line from Jesus to the disciples to the early church and to us. We've got that straight. That right from the beginning, people were contesting what this all means. So those texts are kind of these living testimonies that everybody didn't agree.
Yeah.
That not everybody who would have called themselves a Christian would have picked up the Gospel of Mark and said, "Yep, that's my Jesus." There are Gnostic Christians and other kinds of Christians that would have picked up the text and said, "That I don't recognize this Jesus anymore."
Yeah.
So I think that's important for us to remember. Less is kind of devotional or worship material, but to remember the context in which this emerged, and that God was still moving in the midst of all that, even though there was dispute. I don't know anybody who's been part of a church that didn't fight over things.
I don't know whether you churches like that.
And that's the way it was from the beginning.
Wow.
Yeah.
Well, this has been a really interesting conversation.
Yeah.
Is there anything else you want to bring up, Eric?
I think we covered our bases.
I think we did, and that was really fun.
Good.
Have a little, some disagreement about the canon. That's exciting.
Right. Yeah. We'll arm wrestle next.
Yeah, next time he'll win. All right, well, this has been enjoyable. Thank you for watching, and we'll talk with you soon.
See you soon.
Bye.